Anybody else joins us, but
Okay.
we're really happy that we do have an audience for you. Dottie Susag is joining us. She works with the Humanities Montana organization, and we're really happy to have her here for 2 sessions today and then again on April 7th to talk about the Night Watchman and look at Indian poetry as well. So we're really glad you're here, Dottie, and we'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. We've been sharing some stories here just a little bit while we're waiting to get on. I want to thank Humanities Montana for hosting this, and Ioana and the Center for Bilingual and Multicultural Education, and all of the sponsors that you might have for this invitation. So I have to admit that I'm a descendant of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants, but my education and practice has focused on the rights of all people to tell their own stories. As a teacher, I've made it my mission to include the voices of those who have lived the experiences they write about. More specifically, since 1988, I've worked to find resources from outside the canon. After some criticism on an evaluation from my principal in Sims, Montana, for what he considered my teaching of too much Indian stuff, I would begin my classes at the start of the year with an apology for sometimes using too much white male stuff in my English class. And I would tell him this: to be fair, we will read from a wide variety of genres, cultures, and genders. To help me and my students, I always try to use the voices of the people themselves, considering the authenticity and accuracy of what might be attributed to a specific people or individuals. Having lived in rural Montana since 1970, my husband and I now live in East St. Paul, Minnesota, on Dakota land, 16 miles east and north of the confluence of the Minnesota or Minnesota Makoche and Mississippi rivers, and within minutes of the cities or Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Bloomington Avenue setting in The Night Watchman. Our home is 18 miles east of Louise Erdrich's Birch Bark bookstore, where I have shopped for years. Hyde Erdrich, Louise's sister, talks about her own writing and art and gives us a tour of the bookstore. So I'm going to click on this and then scroll pretty fast to get to where she starts to talk about it. So there were 7 children in that family.
Hey, Dottie. Hey, Dottie.
Yes?
Can you stop sharing your reshare and make sure that you have the box for computer audio checked?
Computer
We
audio,
won't be able to
where
hear it.
is that?
So if you stop sharing,
And where do I do that?
it should be at the top of your screen. It should be a green. It says you're sharing your screen, and then next to it, stop sharing.
And then you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, you're gonna do the stop sharing, and then you're gonna reshare, and then at the bottom lower left-hand corner, there should be a little box that you should check that says share sound.
It doesn't say share sound. Oh yeah, I see it. Okie doke. There we go. Good deal. Okay.
So
Are we ready
now we
now?
should be able to hear it.
Ready? Okay.
Writing books. Grew up in North Dakota in a small town, Wahpeton, which is on the border.
Can you hear that okay now?
I have 6 siblings and a large extended family. My parents were both teachers. You know, I think most people fight their parents on their career paths.
So there's Louise.
They're writers especially, but my sister Louise's career took off, and so my parents didn't object. We're like, yeah, maybe. This is Birch Bark Books, my sister's bookstore. It's a big part of my life. I come here at least once a week. Love the artists and the writers that are represented here. Can you imagine having, Louise Erdrich curate your book selection for you? It's like the best neighborhood bookstore you could possibly hope for. So I really love it. These are the books from Wigwas Press. They're Ojibwe language books that I direct. So I work with the illustrator, the team that produces the writing. They're the only monolingual Ojibwe illustrated books, and they're used by language immersion programs. I have my own poetry world here. Look at this. This one's me, this one's me. Here I am again. This was my first book, Fishing for Myth. And then my second book, National Monuments. This book sold the most of all my books, but I still never got a royalty check over $100. And Cell Traffic is new and selected poems on maternal fetal stem cell traffic, about how cells go back and forth between us and our mother and other generations, our siblings, and how we literally live with one another within one another's bodies. And I thought it was an interesting metaphor to explore. This is Franklin Avenue. It's home to the largest urban American Indian population in the country. It's our little town. I guess, in some places there'd be like a Little Italy. This is the urban res.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there and go back to my slideshow. So this is presenting right now, I think. So Hyde, we're going to use a poem by Hyde Erdrich, but I wanted you to see the inside of that bookstore, and I thought it was nice to have somebody who lives there to tour it. So I'm going to go to a Google Maps to show you where this is. The bookstore is located north of Lake Bade-Makaska, Dakota, for White Bank Lake, in recognition of the people who first called this place home, the largest lake in Minneapolis. Early surveyors had named it after the ardent racist and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. At Erdrich's bookstore, my grandchildren have pet the grizzled and shaggy black dog who sleeps in the center of the store, and they've imagined their own worlds in a playhouse at the back of the store. In 2014, I met Louise in person when I came to the bookstore looking for new Native authored picture books to bring back to Montana. I mean, it is one of the best resources for publications that are just new and just out. They have a wonderful section of young adult literature and their picture books, but they're all not Native authored. Anyway, I met her in person when I came to the bookstore looking for those books. I introduced Louise to my 7-year-old granddaughter, and we talked about the Roundhouse that I just finished reading for the first time. Louise said to us, "I loved finding my way into the mind of a 13-year-old boy." So I don't know how many of you have read The Roundhouse, but that's a powerful novel about a mother, a rape of a woman, and her 13-year-old son's struggle in his grief and his I have to get out of this. And he wants to find out who did it. But of course, the biggest problem is, where did it happen? Who might have done it? Was he white? Was he Native? And so you get a really a great picture of the complications for law and enforcement on reservations. So I'm going to let Henry Louis Gates introduce Louise to you. Here she talks about herself. So here we go with Henry Louis Gates.
American culture often focuses so much, unfortunately, on the present. Many people don't even know their family history beyond perhaps their grandparents say. Is it common within the Native American community to have a strong sense of where or from whom you emerged?
Absolutely. This is something I think that most Native people have from the very beginning, a sense of where their grandparents came from, where they, who they descended from. It's not only the oral tradition that it makes this so important to people. That's the first thing. But it also is the United States government.
How so?
Because we have to have a very detailed description of our background in order to be enrolled in our own tribe. It's a very different sort of situation for minority peoples. We have to know exactly where we came from down to the last degree.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's as though each of us has a sort of inner pie chart.
So the American government not only encourages Native Americans to practice genealogy, but demands that they practice genealogy if they're going to satisfy the requirements of being a Native American.
Well, you could see it that way. You could also see it as a way of, through the generations, diminishing, because people don't always marry within their tribe, diminishing the number of Native Americans. Now, for many, many years, most government policies really had the either express intention or the assumption that Native American people were going to vanish. And in fact, that's why some of the strongest treaties were made between Native tribal nations, sovereign government nations, and the U.S. government. But we didn't vanish. But we still have to have that inner pie chart I'm talking about.
Ferocity about protecting your heritage, your ancestral heritage.
Absolutely. It's a very, very strong component of Native life.
It's
to know
fascinating.
who you are. And my mother made us very proud of who we are.
Okay. Louise Erdrich has written a total of 28 books, at last counting, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, children's books, and numerous short stories and essays. Her novel, The Roundhouse, received the 2012 National Book Award, and The Night Watchman is a finalist in the Minnesota Book Awards that will be announced April 29th. Louise Erdrich is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, and Métis Indians in North Dakota and Minnesota. She is a passionate political advocate for Indigenous women, those missing and victims of rape or murder. In 2019, nearly 5,600 Native American women were reported missing. It's an unbelievable number, according to the FBI's National Crime Information Center. And that was January 31st, 2020. Louise Erdrich belongs to what has come to be called the Native American Renaissance of the 1960s and 70s, including Pulitzer Prize winner N. Scott Momaday, Kiowa, our National Poet Laureate, Joe Harjo, Muskogee Creek, James Welch, Blackfeet, Grovant, Leslie Marmon Silko, Laguna Pueblo, Mexican, and many more. Over the years, I've worked closely with poets in Montana, such as these you will hear today. At a gathering in Bozeman 6 years ago, Minerva Allen, a Assiniboine, said to me, Dottie, they all came together, the poets that we had compiled for this Birthright collection. She said, Dottie, we are all together again. And I thought, this is a different tribe, is what it is. It is a tribe of poets. We are family. It is because of the faithful support from them and so many more that I'm here with you today. So we are going to be looking, I'm just going to open this up and show it to you, then I'll.
Welcome to Montana Indian
So
Poets
these are the
Online Meeting.
videos
I'm
of
Mike
all of
Jetty,
the poets
Indian
reading
Education
their
Specialist with
poems.
the Office of Public
And
Instruction.
two
At
of
the
the
site, you can
poets,
watch and hear poets reading.
two of the poets read their poems have been written in their own languages, primarily Dick Little Bear, and on the 7th of April, we'll hear a poem that he reads. He doesn't read it in Cheyenne, but it is printed in the Northern Cheyenne language in Birthright. And then we have the text for the birthright also. And so if you have the PowerPoint available here, you can see what the URLs for each one of these things that I've pulled up here, okay? Does anybody have a question about that right now? Nope. Okay. So I want you to be thinking about this. But as far as the poets go, these poets share similar insights into a collective but individual human experience, while they bring to our attention the unique perspective of contemporary Native writers. And then to speak about The Night Watchman, it is an historical novel about family and land, heritage and ancestry, and the rights of each individual to determine his or her or their own identity. It's a novel about the search for justice. It's about the influence of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe tradition and story on worldview. Consequently, the worldview provides an understanding of events and possible means for challenging and surviving even the greatest possible tragedies. In this novel, Erdrich straightforwardly deals with the juxtaposition of two languages, and that's why I think it's relevant for your group to read this novel, the Ojibwe or Chippewa language and the duplicitous language of government. So in April, we will be talking about language. As you read, you will find references to language and the burdens the Ojibwe characters experience when government representatives talk to them rather than with them. But before we go any further, I'd like you to respond to any or all of the following questions. Is there anybody that wants to say anything about any of these? It's the way I generally begin, or it might be an assignment I give to students. What disturbs you about what you read, what interests you, what confuses you, and it might be words or sentences, and what enlightens you as you read this novel. I want to be honest that when I read Erdrich's novels that include the Ojibwe language, she doesn't define it immediately. You have to understand what it might mean through the context if you're not an Ojibwe speaker. But does anybody have anything they want to say about any of these? No? Okay.
It's a good prompt list.
Huh?
It's a very good prompting list.
Oh, that's good. Was that Stephanie? Who was that said that?
Oh, I'm sorry, it was Cheryl Crawley.
Oh, hi, Cheryl. Okay. So the guiding question that we have for this whole presentation is this: how can we enrich our experience with this novel when we consider the following 5 topics in the novel with poetry together and the ways it contributes to deeper understandings? I love to mix whatever I'm doing with poetry. And in the early 90s, I started teaching everything I taught in English language arts. I would pull up a native poem or a short story, or where appropriate, a traditional story to exemplify, so that it became ordinary and common for them to have pairings of different genres that portray different themes. So it is something that I really work with. I just finished teaching at the Bozeman Field School. I had 12 classes, 90 minutes each, to cover this novel. And there was a lot of poetry that went along with it. So today we're going to look at historical and geographical contexts, major characters, and then on April 7th, we're going to focus on the duplicitous use of language. So we will look at the termination Bill, and then humor, and then identity. And when we get to the identity, then we'll do more poetry. Okay. So I'm not really sure where, okay. Excuse me, I just flipped 2 pages. Okay, so at the very beginning of the novel, Erdrich explains how she came to write The Night Watchman. And here she reads, but that isn't where oh, here it is. Here she reads from that text. So this is Louise Erdrich reading. There's no visual except the picture of the novel. But she's
On August 1st, 1953,
tell about the beginning.
the United States Congress announced House Concurrent Resolution 108, a bill to abrogate nation-to-nation treaties, which had been made with American Indian nations for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. The announcement called for the eventual termination of all tribes and the immediate termination of 5 tribes, including the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. My grandfather, Patrick Gorno, fought against termination as tribal chairman while working as a night watchman. He hardly slept, like my character Thomas Wajashk. This book is fiction, but all the same, I have tried to be faithful to my grandfather's extraordinary life. Any failures are my own. Other than Thomas and the Turtle Mountain jewel-bearing plant, the only other major character who resembles anyone alive or dead is Senator Arthur V. Watkins, relentless pursuer of native dispossession and the man who interrogated my grandfather. Pixie, or excuse me, Patrice, is completely fictional. September 1953.
She also, in this piece here, reads the first chapter. So if any of you have access to the PowerPoint then, or slideshow afterwards, then you can play that and listen to that as well. Okay, so these are the 5, and really in other places they are listed differently, but these are actually the 6 major policy periods that Essential Understandings Regarding Montana Indians has identified. And there is this Essential Understandings text that OPI has just recently revised with lots of pictures, et cetera. But the federal Indian policy periods that are alluded to or featured in this novel are treaty making and removal, reservation period, allotment and assimilation, the tribal reorganization period, and termination and relocation. So I'm just going to open this up. This is what the OPI document Essential Understandings looks like. And I'm going to go down to page 23, where it deals with termination. And the primary purpose here is to look at the tribes and the reservations in Montana. So we are, of course, paying attention to a North Dakota one right now. But Essential Understanding number 5 deals with each of the federal Indian policies. And so we get to the termination policy right here. So if you want to read what, and this has been composed with tribal people's influence in Montana. So this is the language that they wanted to use, the Tribal Cultural Committee. I'm not too sure all of the people that are involved in it, but for the most part, that's who has been involved. So I'm going to get out of this and click a few of these that are extras that are annoying. Okay, so here we go to the next one. What I did was look at some reviews, but regarding the Indian education, the essential understandings, the Foundation for Guiding Indian Education for All in Montana began in 1999 when American Indian educators from the Montana tribes met in Helena to discuss the most important issues regarding Montana tribes that all Montanans need to understand. The product of these discussions is in the publication, Essential Understandings. Two major storylines form the substance of the Night Watchman, and both are linked in one set of federal Indian policies: termination, which is Thomas's story, and relocation, Vera and Patrice's story. In short, termination resulted in the abrogation of treaties and the destruction of tribal rights to sovereignty, and relocation sought to remove young Indian people from reservation communities to cities around the country to save money for the federal government and to further disenfranchise Native young people and assimilate them into the European American culture. Some reviewers have suggested that this is actually two novels packed into one, but I disagree. They are both rooted in conflict with the federal government and its representatives' efforts to decide for Native people from across the continent who they are and who they should be. In The Night Watchman, each of the lead characters in this novel chooses to powerfully define their own identities distinctly tribal and ancestral, yet individual and contemporary. This is sovereignty. In a New York Times book review, Luis Alberto Urrea, Mexican-American poet, novelist, storyteller, writes, as a literary work, and that's where his review comes from, The Night Watchman is high drama, low comedy, ghost stories, mystical visions, family and tribal lore, wed to a surprising outbreak of enthusiasm for boxing matches. So one of my friends wasn't interested in the boxing part, but it is engaging. Mixed with political fervor and a terrifying undercurrent of predation and violence against women. But in his May 5th, 2020 Los Angeles Review of Books, Thomas Millay addresses the political work in this novel. He says the real horror that lies behind the government efforts that Thomas must challenge, according to CR 108, Indians will be freed, now we're talking about the termination bill, from their marginal status and made full citizens, entitled to the same privileges and responsibilities as are applicable to other citizens of the United States, so as to grant them all the rights and prerogatives pertaining to American citizenship. But for the figures in Erdrich's novel and the real people they represent, those words meant something far more insidious. What the bill does is effectively declare that Indians are not to be considered Indians anymore. So I want you to look at this map. Oh, by the way, the language that we just heard is going to be part of the discussion on April 7th. So look at this map, and can anybody share? Unmute yourselves if you want to talk. What do you notice about this map?
It looks like the Crow Reservation and the way it got reduced over time.
Yes. But how much time? That's what blows my mind.
Yeah, in 1904, huh?
Secession 1863, Turtle Mountain Reservation 18,
Oh, okay, so they lost the pink part in
19
1863. Yeah,
19 years.
okay.
I always ask students, so where do you hunt? Because most of the students I work with virtually now in Montana are hunters. Where do you hunt? Oh, in the mountains and on the prairies. I said, okay, so maybe your dad used to, but now you can only hunt in your backyard. What are you going to find? I mean, they just really, it's unthinkable what happened. This is a greater part of Bibon's story as the narrator in The Night Watchman tells it. So, Ioana, do you want to read from page 68?
Yes.
Okay.
As a boy, Bibon had traveled along the medicine line into Assiniboine, Grovant, and Blackfeet territory. Then his family swung down along the Milk River, hunting buffalo. He had come back to the Turtle Mountains when there was no other choice. They were confined on the reservation and had to get permission from the farmer in charge to pass its boundaries. For a while, they were not allowed to go off to search for food. And one terrible winter, the old people starved themselves so that the young people could continue. Bibon had tried farming with the seed wheat, iron plow, and ox that the farmer in charge had issued on him on strict conditions that the family not kill and eat the ox. The first year, nothing. They had to take turns sneaking past the boundaries, picking up buffalo bones to sell to the bone dealers. The next year, they did not plant the white man's grain, but corn, squash, and beans. The family dried the crops and cached the food. They didn't quite starve, but by spring they could barely walk. They were so skinny and weak, it took many years of finding what plants grew best in which soil, liked a wet or dry spot, sun in morning or afternoon. Thomas had learned from his father's experiments.
So I really like the way she pulls in the stories of the real human experience. And of course, we're talking about going across Montana and then, so the Chippewa, I mean, that's part of the story of the Rocky Boy people. In fact, one of the individuals that was on one of the treaties that was part of the treaty situation here in North Dakota and the Turtle Mountain was Rocky Boy. So if you read about those treaties in the background, you can read more about Rocky Boy and how he was involved there. So in her afterword, Erdrich writes, a total of 113 tribal nations suffered the disaster of termination. And I read someplace else a different number, but not much different. 1.4 million acres of tribal land was lost. And that's because of the termination. That's after the treaties. Not one tribe profited. In fact, the Turtle Mountain delegation was the first to mount a fierce defense and ultimately to prevail. So some of those of you from Montana, tribal communities maybe know about how your tribe in particular dealt with the termination issue. So Thomas is, his name that she gives him is Washushk, which is the muskrat who helps to remake the earth. And in the novel, Thomas helps to remake the earth for the Chippewa people after the flood of Indian policies. So that's the metaphor. We're going to listen to Denise Juneau read James Welch's poem, The Man from Washington. I want you to think as you listen about the losses the Turtle Mountain people might have suffered. In one of the last treaties, the Macomber Agreement is often called the 10-cent treaty for the $1 million paid for 9 million acres ceded to the federal government in 1892. I can provide links for you to review regarding those treaties if you wish. But we're going to listen to Denise Juneau read this poem, and then we'll talk about some questions. Oops, that didn't work. I have to click on this. Here we go.
I'm from Brownie, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation, where James Welch is from as well. And so it's an honor to be able to read his poetry for this project. I really am a fan of James Welch. I was a teacher in Browning, and I taught Fool's Crow. That was one of my favorite novels. And so, again, it's an honor to be able to do this. The Man from Washington by James Welch. The end came easy for most of us. Packed away in our crude beginnings in some corner of a flat world, we didn't expect much more than firewood and buffalo robes to keep us warm. The man came down, a slouching dwarf with rainwater eyes, and spoke to us. He promised that life would go on as usual, that treaties would be signed, and everyone, man, woman, and child, would be inoculated against a world in which we had no part. A world of money, promise, and disease.
We're going to listen to it again. And
Hi, I'm Denise Juneau, State
something
Superintendent
here.
of Public Instruction. I'm from Brownie, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation, where James Welch is from as well. And so it's an honor to be able to read his poetry for this project. I really am a fan of James Welch. I was a teacher in Browning, and I taught Fool's Crow. That was one of my favorite novels. And so, again, it's an honor to be able to do this. The Man from Washington by James Welch. The end came easy for most of us. Packed away in our crude beginnings in some corner of a flat world, we didn't expect much more than firewood and buffalo robes to keep us warm. The man came down, a slouching dwarf with rainwater eyes, and spoke to us. He promised that life would go on as usual, that treaties would be signed, and everyone, man, woman, and child, would be inoculated against a world in which we had no part, a world of money, promise, and disease.
Oops. It's really hard to get past some of the stuff that keeps sliding down. So I'm trying to get rid of it here. And post attendee, I don't want that. Oops, what happened here? Oh,
It looks like you stopped sharing.
okay, so I have to start that again. Share sound, share. Okay. Well, I don't want to go here. That I'm trying to get rid of this stuff. I'm trying to get rid of it up here, but I can't. Oh, there, okay. So, and there is a mistake on this. It's not we promised, it's he promised. So promise, disillusionment, and betrayal are themes in Welch's poem. And as we listen to Denise read the poem, I want to know, can you think about how does it resonate with a novel and or treaty and termination policies? Anybody?
Ask your
Sorry,
question again.
who was that? They wanted you to ask your question again, Dottie. This is Ioana.
How
and I
does
think-
it resonate
Yeah.
with the novel or treaty and termination policies? And then if you want to talk, where do you find irony?
Well, for me, again, that things are being discussed and decided and they have no input whatsoever. And that whole thing, yeah, when I heard he and saw we, I thought, wait a second, we promised. No, there's
No,
no
yeah, no, that's
promising anything.
I meant to
Yeah.
fix it and I didn't get
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
But that, simple life, doing your own life, and then government people making decisions that will greatly impact you and you have absolutely no say in it.
And the irony is in being inoculated against a world of money and promise.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yep. Okay. This section, we deal with the major characters in the novel. And if you downloaded the study guide, you see these. When I first read this novel with my husband last summer, we could not keep track of the characters. So I made a list, and then I, of course, went back and made another list for the presentation and the work that I'm doing now. But I had to do this in order to organize who's who, because you keep, actually, Thomas Washosh in the novel has all kinds of children. I mean, some are foster children, but they just come in for a little bit. And, but you get the sense that he and his wife are really responsible for several people. So B-Bone is his father. And, but the one I want you to think about now is who is Thomas. He's the tribal chairman and the night watchman at the Turtle Mountain jewel bearing plant. Based on Erdrick's grandfather, Patrick Journeau, he is named Washosh, or muskrat, the animal that helped remake the world after the flood. Thomas helped to remake the earth for the Chippewa people, of course. The nights when Thomas works at the plant, he reads newspapers and writes letters to people who have business with the tribe, official correspondence. He brings midnight lunches with carrots he's raised himself, commodity cheese, venison sandwiches with Rose's championship yeast bread. This is a salaried position, but he's not a rich man. On weekends, he uses the team and wagon, and this is in the early 50s, to haul water for drinking. For bathing and cleaning, they have rain barrels. In winter, they melt snow. He first hears about the termination bill from his friend Moses Montrose, whose good friend in the Bureau of Indian Affairs has given Moses a copy of the bill. He tells Thomas, they mean to drop us. Thus begins the work of the tribal council and ultimately the entire tribe to fully deny the federal government's efforts. Thomas and possibly Erdrick's grandfather attended the Fort Totten boarding school in North Dakota. And you can see here some of the photographs of that boarding school today. It's a historic site today, but there are some of the older boarding schools. So it was about, I think, maybe 80 miles from the Turtle Mountain Reservation. Okay. Huh. Okay. And but I want you to think about who Patrice is next. Her family name is Pronto, and the father is an alcoholic. Janet is extremely, she is very traditional. She speaks Chippewa Ojibwe very fluently, and but Patrice works at the Turtle Mountain jewel bearing plant. She eats lard on bread or poor people food. She speaks Chippewa, but she learned English, was class valedictorian, and became a Catholic. But she followed her mother's teachings and she knows her mother's song. Living between two worlds, Patrice is not blind to the differences between her world and that of Doris Lauder, a white girl. Doris's parents bought Chippewa land from the bank in 1910, a result of the allotment program when Indians were forced to sell their land for food and short-term survival. So who is Patrice? Quote, there were times when Patrice felt like she was stretched across a frame like a skin tent. She tried to forget that she could easily blow away, or how easily her alcoholic, abusive father could wreck them all. This feeling of being the only barrier between her family and disaster wasn't new, but they had come so far since she started work. So this is a picture of the work that they did at this jewel bearing plant. And one of the issues that comes later is that Patrice suffers glaucoma because you think about their eyes and how close they had to be getting. So here are a few pictures. It still exists, but now it's called the William Langer jewel bearing plant. And I mean, it was a much bigger organization, and it was for certain an industrial plant. And it was the Turtle Mountain people that were responsible for bringing this industry to their reservation. But this is what the women looked like at their tables, and how close they had to get, because they were making these, and this is more of it. Yeah. Okay, how close they had to get to be doing the work that they were doing, but it was good pay for them, and they used them to do this, the women, because they were so used to beatings, so they had lots of practice in looking at very small things. We're going to link another poem here. Joe McGeeshick was born and raised on the Fort Peck Reservation, and in some ways, Patrice's life resonates in McGeeshick's poem, If I Lived in That House. So, Joanna, you want to read this?
Yes. If I lived in that house, a father would read to his daughter. A man would throw a ball to a boy. A woman would softly kiss a child. A family would sit and eat a meal. A knock would go unanswered. A girl would cry in her small room. A boy would stand alone, staring down a hallway. A shiny faucet would drip into a white sink. A bare light would cast a yellow beam onto a porch. A dark silence would fill the black winter night. A rainstorm would blur an open field, and a man would not think too hard.
So what I'd like you to do is think about, tell me, where does the focus shift in this poem? It's pretty positive to begin with. Where does it shift?
Between a knock would go unanswered and a girl would cry in her room.
Yeah, or even just before a knock would go unanswered, because you've got a family sitting and eating a meal, and then a knock would go unanswered. And so when I was putting together Birthright, I asked the poets if they would share what was their inspiration for that particular poem. And this is what Joe said. He said, I was in Bozeman walking along a street with these huge, old, opulent houses, and I was thinking about growing up in a tribal house.
Dottie, it's such an honor for me to read this poem because Joe is a dear friend of mine.
Oh.
And I take, or used to take before COVID, the streamlined blue bus every
Uh-huh.
day to campus. And we
Uh-huh.
rode down, of course, Wilson Avenue is what he's referring to,
Oh, yeah.
where Story Mansion and all of those incredible houses are. And I think about this poem and what he shared every single day that I took the bus.
Yeah.
Because that whole idea of where you grow up and what your family has and how different your life is, depending on your circumstances. So.
Right, right. And when you think about Patrice in the novel, this is what she's growing up with, and you get a sense she's getting a ride to work every day in Doris Lauder, who's white, whose parents are living on Indian land that they got cheaply because the native people were, for most of the part, were forced to sell that land in order to survive. And so she rides, but she does not ever invite Doris into her home. And yet she loves her home. She loves how she lives. And she doesn't, you'll find out later, she doesn't want to be anyplace else. I think it's just really powerful the way it shows this between two worlds that we see these people are living in. Then getting back to Patrice again. Patrice is the strong woman. She's only, she's 19, who fights off boys who would rape her. And she rejects the white teacher with haystack hair because he doesn't smell good. Her mother doesn't think he smells good either. She isn't going to get married and be tied down. And despite a fear of riding the train and traveling away from the reservation alone, Patrice follows an address scratched on a piece of paper. Patrice knows who she is. She's Chippewa. Home is Turtle Mountain. And in this strange place in the cities, she thinks, I am a stranger to myself. Another person harder and bolder than the usual Patrice had taken her over. Erdrich has created the storyline of Vera, to the right on your screen, Patrice's older sister, from the lives of many missing Indigenous women. It's no surprise that Erdrich's cities, Minneapolis or St. Paul, Minnesota, that is what people in the outlying states call Minneapolis, St. Paul. They say, well, are you going to the cities? Well, that's what we're talking about. The setting is actually one of the largest and most tribally diverse urban American Indian populations, numbering well over 35,000. Across the country, roughly 7 out of 10 American Indians now live in cities. 7 out of 10, according to a January 2018 article in the Decolonial Atlas. But to the family at home on Turtle Mountain, Vera is lost, having left to follow the promise of the relocation program. Now, I couldn't find a poster for the Twin Cities, but I found this one from Denver. So look at the promise. Patrice, this younger sister of her sister Vera, who's left to follow this promise, she finds this poster, come to Minneapolis, the chance of your lifetime. Good jobs in retail trade, manufacturing, happy homes, beautiful homes, many churches. And she asked the girl, the clerk, don't you keep track of where people go? And the clerk answers, not after a while. Remember James Welch's The Man from Washington poem, we would be inoculated against a world in which we had no part, a world of money, promise, and disease. And then there was this article that I found in the Minneapolis Tribune, I think, how America's past shapes Native Americans' present. And this is just a section from it. So Ioana, do you want to read that? You can read from the screen.
Just read from the screen? Okay.
Yeah.
How America's Past Shapes Native Americans' Present, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Native American poverty doesn't fit the image many may have of life on secluded, depleted reservations. Most Native Americans now live in cities, where many are still trying to adjust to urban life. As a group, Native Americans face a 27% poverty rate and are still trying to reverse some of the lasting effects of federal policies that have put them at a disadvantage for hundreds of years. The Indian Relocation Act of 1956 was the impetus for the relocation of the large number of Native Americans now living in urban areas. Though the act didn't force people to leave their reservations, it made it hard for families to stay by dissolving federal recognition of most tribes and ending federal funding for reservations, schools, hospitals, and basic services, along with the jobs they created. Though the federal government paid for relocation expenses to the cities and provided some vocational training, urban Native Americans faced high levels of job discrimination and few opportunities for job advancement.
Okay, so I want you to remember that this novel is historical fiction. So the Relocation Act occurred in 1956. The story here, because of the termination bill, occurred in 1953. So Erdrich chose to incorporate the events from relocation in 1956 to 1953 to coincide with the tribe's defense against the Termination Act. And I think that's a fair thing for her to have done. So if Patrice is going to find Vera, which she wants to do, Wood Mountain, a young man that really falls in love with her, tells her, when you get to the cities, go to the scum and definitely the not police. Once she finds the address she's looking for, Jack, her driver, tells her this. So what can happen to a girl in your situation or your sister's situation is this. With the unpaid bills and all, she runs out on the landlord. Makes it hard to get a new place. So maybe she changes her name. Or maybe she moves in with somebody else. A friend, let's say. She pays the friend in money or in services. It's important to consider why Vera is not a fully developed character, as some readers have commented. Representing one of the thousands of missing girls and women, her vague representation and story is more honest and definitely more tragic when told more through the eyes of those who miss her. So Patrice fulfills what Erdrich no doubt wishes could happen for every lost girl or woman. At great risk, Patrice searches for her. For certain, the Night Watchman and the Roundhouse have definitely raised awareness and hope. So this is a poem that I think can be a statement connected with the women in this novel. By the way, I read not too long ago that for all of Erdrich's novels that deal with tragedy and loss, they all end up positive. So there are horrific ends of many of these stories, but she doesn't end her novels with those very horrific endings. So Hyde Erdrich, Louise Erdrich's sister, herself a published poet, the person who introduced us to Louise Erdrich's bookstore at the beginning of this presentation. She was the kind, as you read the novel, think about how this poem speaks to the lives of the women in the novel, especially Patrice. It speaks to themes of personal loss and survival and the strength of women. So maybe Cheryl would like to read this from the screen. You want to do that?
She was the kind to tell it like it is, to kiss and tell, to kiss and to kill with kindness. She was the kind to get things through her thick skull, to work her fingers to the bone, to work on her back, to never take it lying down, She was the kind to lay down the law, to get down on her knees, to get up on her feet, to give an inch and take a mile. She was the kind to stand up for herself, to sit down, strike, to go to the wall, to take it to the limit. She was the kind to take it too far, to drop off the face of the earth, to face the music, to hit rock bottom. She was the kind to get back on that horse and ride it, to get up on her high horse, to get down to business, to turn the world upside down. I love this because it is exactly the use of some of those kinds of prepositions that I talked about the last time we were together.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. And then there was one more thing I was just now thinking about, but I can't remember it right now. But does anybody want to say anything else? Oh, I know. At the beginning of the novel, and I read it earlier, that Patrice was like, she felt like the skin stretched over a tent, that she was the barrier between her family and trouble. So when they feared that the father, alcoholic father, was going to come home, Patrice was the one that would stand watch. Because this was a family, the youngest is a boy, Pokey, but for the most part, it's Patrice who's got to be responsible for everybody. So when Patrice gets to the cities, she's going to a place where she's going to dress up like a blue ox, but I wanted to show you, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this mythology of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, but this represents that amazing overtake of native country when, after the treaties were done and the tribal people thought they were going to be able to eat and fish and hunt and use the woods as they usually had, in come all the loggers. When they signed those treaties, they had no idea how much logging was going to be done. So there are 40 acres in northern Minnesota that were surveyed and were left. They are the only old trees in Minnesota. And some of those trees, most of those trees in this 40 acres, we walked through it, my husband and I, that are 400 years old. The rest are no more than 100 years old because the whole place was logged. And this is the guy that's responsible for it. So in the novel, she goes to the cities to try and find Vera, and she ends up at a place that's called this bar. It's called the Log Jam 26, but Erdrich really based it on this place that was a real place called the Palms. And in that Palms was a tub of water that women would be dressed in this blue ox-like rubber outfit and dance. And one of the ironies, tragic ironies of that in the novel is that it had to be sprayed with pesticide all the time. And so the women that had been dancing in it got very sick, and at least one of them had died. So this is a job that Patrice gets when she gets to the cities. How many, has anybody here read that far? Have you gotten that far? So I'm going to show you what Bloomington Avenue looks like now, and you can see, so here is the place where that bar existed, that had that big tub for a ox to, a woman dressed up as an ox would dance around inside. But look at, this is the Indian country in Minneapolis. All Nations Indian Church, Minnesota Indian Women's, Phillips Community Center, all of these are Indian, Fond du Lac, Mushkiki, the pharmacy. But this is in Minneapolis. This is Indian country in Minneapolis. And here is African Community Services. I was in the doctor's office this afternoon and a woman came in. She's probably Somali but most likely Somali. She could not understand when the woman asked her if she could change her appointment to 140. So the language barrier is really significant for them. Okay.
Dottie,
Yep.
sorry, excuse me, a quick question because someone put in the chat, why was the pesticide used on the Blue Ox latex outfit?
Because I don't know what kind of crawlies might have been on the inside. I can't see any of the chat. Well, I could maybe.
That's the only question in there right now.
That's the only question that came. Does anybody else have anything you want to say? Nope. Okay, so then there's another family, Iron Bear and Blue family. So Arshile is, he is the father of this young man, Wood Mountain, who is a major character in the novel. He's the love interest, one of the love interests for Patrice, but he's also a boxer. And in the novel, they have a boxing match where they raise money to send the tribal people to Washington to testify against the termination of the Turtle Mountain Reservation, Turtle Mountain people. And but Arshile is Lakota Sioux, and everybody else is Chippewa or Métis. But he's an old friend of Thomas's. So Juggy represents a link between the white and the Chippewa community. She serves on the Tribal Advisory Council with Thomas, and she's the caretaker and cook for the bachelor's quarters. Juggy is the mother of Wood Mountain, who follows Patrice to the cities. And then the last family we're going to look at today is the Pipestone family and the major characters. Louis Pipestone represents the tribal leader who persists in seeking the signatures from each and every tribal member on the petition. He had to go, and he could speak Chippewa, he could speak English, so he could communicate with everybody. And that is true, that is what had to happen. They had to get signatures from as many tribal people as they could. And there was no end to where they would go. And Grace Pipestone is his daughter who races horses. So that's another other storyline. But he has a daughter with a white woman whose parents would not let her marry him. But she got pregnant, and then she raised Millie in Minnesota, away from the reservation. But she is the Chippewa scholar who is going to the University of Montana, and they need somebody who's a scholar. And in truth, as far as the real history goes, they got several people who went together that were scholars who did the research, had to compile all the data about how responsible yet how needy the Turtle Mountain people were. And that was a trick. So in the novel, it just is represented by one individual. Labat is the evening janitor. And, but and Betty Pye, like Vera, she could make life's bitterness into comedy, but we're going to talk about comedy next time. So I have a few minutes that I will begin this part. I want you to think about these three questions. What does a word or a phrase say? That's the denotation. And that's what is a dictionary definition. And you could define anything but with a synonym. That is what how you answer that question. But then you need to think, what does that word or phrase mean to various audiences? So it's not too hard to realize that what was in these bills was for an audience of white people, and that would appease the white people, but the real meaning of the words meant something entirely different to the Native people. But why does the meaning matter to those audiences? And most of the time, the meaning matters because however the audience takes the meaning, then that is what they will act on. They act on the meaning they get, not on the denotation of it. So in James Welch's poem, the Native people, the Blackfeet people thought one thing about what those promises meant, and they acted on it. They cooperated, not entirely, but they did. I mean, Heavy Runner is a horrific story of cooperation gone awry. But I want you to think, I use this strategy a lot too with anything that we're reading. So, so here it is again, and I'm going to give you some examples. For example, he was having a bad day. So now what is the denotative or the literal meaning, explicit meaning of a bad day? What it is general, what's bad? Is it horrific? Or is it just not so good? I mean, if you think about what's bad, but this is what that one chief said, referring to the man who murdered 8 people, 6 Asians in Atlanta. So it has become a big issue, so much so that he's not in front of the public anymore. What does that word or phrase mean to various audiences? Anybody want to give me some different audiences?
Stephanie has a sore throat, so let me share what she's written in the chat.
Okay.
It means, so having a bad day means having a day that didn't work out the way someone wanted it to go or work out.
Okay, good. So who are the various audiences that picked up on this phrase that chief said? Who are the audiences?
So everybody knows this is current events, right? And that you're talking about a chief of police, because in our
Yes, right,
context
right,
today,
right.
we don't want to confuse people that this is not
No,
part of
right.
the novel. Okay,
Yeah, right.
Dottie?
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to help you get into this questioning because we are going to be doing it with the termination bill in 2 weeks. So one of the audiences is maybe his fellow policeman, or maybe, but for sure, some of the audiences were relatives of those who died, or Asian people across the country, or
I think potential potential jurors. He's trying, to me, when I heard that, it was just so inappropriate. And I thought, who's he trying to convince? Like, like anybody thinks that's acceptable, that if you're having a bad day, you get to murder 8 people. So to me, I felt like, who's he kidding?
Yeah.
It felt like because of who the shooter was, that he wanted to protect him somehow.
I think that's the way a lot of people took it also. Having worked around a lot of police officers as a school administrator, I know that they have a tendency to use this kind of language. And I think they do it in a way to help normalize things for the person who's being arrested. And I think it calms the situation a little bit so that they can actually get somebody into custody without having further problems.
Oh, wow.
But I know that this has been taken a very different way in current politics.
Sure. But very personal. I mean, if somebody comes and terrorizes you and then you hear somebody say he was having a bad day, I mean, what it also indicates is that there is a huge lack of empathy for the people that suffered.
Yes, absolutely, because this was delivered in a public setting, and there should have been a whole lot of consideration as to that audience.
Right. So I'm going to give you another look at these. Look at these names of wars. What do they all have in common?
War. Non-peace.
It kind of seems like it's a racist theme going on.
Oh,
That's where I see it as. I'm Eva. I'm from Susag Nation.
oh, hi, Eva. Okay.
Hi. I was I don't have any social media and I hardly watch news, so I hardly know what's going on besides the pandemic.
Uh-huh.
But when they arrested that guy, they didn't portray him as a terrorist, like how they would portray other people that did something awful.
Right.
So I kind of see that from my view as racism, and then people marching now and stuff like that. And not only did that make other racist stuff happen, like I heard another shooting in a grocery store.
Yes.
And that's kind of crazy because I go out with my kids all the time and I don't think about getting shot up at the store. But anyways, I see this thing as a race thing, not only for Asians, but for us Aboriginals who have been here from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I also had a question for that map you were showing.
Yeah.
Do they have traditional land? And if so, how big is our traditional land?
Oh boy. Actually it's much bigger, and I don't have a map of that. But one of the treaties split the Minnesota and the North Dakota Ojibwe people. And so the Ojibwe are in northern Minnesota and northern North Dakota. So it's pretty significant. The Dakota people have lived in the southern part of Minnesota and then across the Dakotas. But I think their original land, actually, the Chippewa people came from across the Great Lakes because of the encroachment into their area on the east side of the Great Lakes. And that's maybe 200, 300 years ago that they moved to the Minnesota area, and then the Dakotas, and then up into Canada too. I mean, it's a huge area. So
when I was working with Trans Canada, sorry. I was working with Aboriginal relations and safety, and I asked my supervisor at the time why I guess governments are so different from like the Canadian side versus, the US side.
Uh-huh.
And what she told me was that, here in Canada, before any people like go drill on the land or whatever, they consult chief and council and, the members and all that.
Mhm.
But then in the States, they don't do any of that. They just go on and start drilling and, it's their
Oh,
land.
really? Oh.
Yeah. So that's where I learned the difference between, well, obviously the government and then how their land. So now when I think of people like going in and just doing whatever, like that's kind of the government allows that. And I kind of wish back then, if we didn't have like language barriers, that things might have been handled differently
Mm-hmm.
instead of like, this is our land, we're taking over.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well,
okay.
the three major groups that came to North America were the French and the English and the Spanish. And the French paid attention to listening to the native people. There were fewer conflicts, and so then that ended, that was the situation. So they didn't come with the, I'm being very generic here, but they didn't come with a conquering kind of an idea that the priests that were in the missions up there were listening to the native people. So part of the Canadian heritage, I think, because it's French, has something to do with that. Whereas here it was the English, and of course the Spanish, I think, were the worst. Good old Columbus.
Okay,
so
thank you.
One more comment I want to make about this list. Korean, Vietnam, Indian, Chinese. These wars in particular are named for the enemy. So do you think Native people talk about Indian wars as Indian wars? No. And do you think in Vietnam they call it the Vietnam War? No. And the same in Korea? No. So the victors name the wars by the enemy they choose. So that is what has made the problem with the suffering that Asian people are experiencing now is because the pandemic has been called the Chinese virus. And that's all it took to really, really push Asian people as being at fault here. And so, and yet in public schools today, there's a whole series of wars, and they all are named what I have on this list here. And there's a little bitty book that's entitled Indian Wars. And I've had librarians take that off their shelves and put it in a place where it is not part of, it doesn't mean they shouldn't deal with it, but they have to really ask the questions. What are we communicating when we're teaching our kids? Who is the enemy? The enemy were the Indians. It's part of what I teach when I teach critical literacy. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing and see if there's anybody that wants to say anything else. I'm very grateful for the responses you had. Is there anything you want to talk about? Thank you, Eva.
I'll just say that I love Louise's writing, and but I have to pace it because it's very emotional.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm glad you got me to start reading her book. It's the latest one. And I appreciate your the sociolinguists, linguistics that I hear you talking about in your literature.
Mm. Oops, my brother calls me every day almost, but he calls when I'm teaching a class. I'll call him back.
That's nice.
So any questions? I see some chat here now.
Casey, do we have the link for everybody to provide feedback?
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat here.
For Humanities Montana, they'd like us to provide feedback. So if you'd each take a couple minutes to provide some feedback for Dottie, that would be great. So you're putting it in the chat, Casey, you said?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm just opening up Qualtrics here because it logged me out. So
okay.
Okay, so in 2 weeks, I still think if you haven't read the novel, it's okay. Because we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at an address that Lincoln made, his inaugural address and comments about Native people. I don't know how many of you have been able to watch the CNN special on Lincoln, but that's been powerful. And then we'll look at the Dawes Act, which most of you probably are familiar with, but I have somebody explaining it. And then I have a little video about boarding school. And then we look at the Termination Act and Arthur Watkins and the duplicitous language. When I've taught that particular strategy to students, they do say to me later, I'll never read something the same way I did before. I'm always going to ask, what does that mean to those people? Well, Ron Johnson, senator from our neighboring state, Wisconsin, made his comments about how he wasn't afraid of that insurrection. He wouldn't have called it that because they weren't Black people. That's basically what he was saying. And I don't think that's getting political. I think that's getting real. As far as what people are saying and what they might mean. We need to be asking the questions. Does anybody?
Casey, do we need to put this link into Safari or something to be able to fill out the form?
You should be able just to click on it and it should open up in a browser.
It's not doing it for me.
Yeah, you
I
can
just
also
clicked on it.
yeah.
It opened up immediately for me. I don't know. Try
Yeah,
again.
I guess it depends on your computer settings. You can
Yeah.
also copy and paste it into the web browser as well.
Okay, I'll do that.
That noise that was going on in our furnace room has quit, but that lasted almost an hour. I mean, it was almost like you think some kind of a motor is going to burn out. It was that kind of a sound. We've hardly had anybody come. We live in a neighborhood of people. I mean, you don't have to be retired to live here. There's maybe a third of the people are still working, but there are 4 disabled men who live in our neighborhood, and everybody is super conscientious that they aren't exposing themselves to the virus. So the man next door came in for the first time in about 9 months. Oh, maybe almost a year probably, because he's a go-to guy that Sylvan will ask to come in, but he came in with his mask. He's had a shot. We're fully vaccinated, but It's a different time.
Thanks, Dorothy.
Well, thank you so much for coming, you guys.
Yes, thank you so much, Dottie. So everybody, we're going to continue this discussion on April 7th. I'll send out a reminder again, Dottie, at the beginning of that week.
Okay.
And
Okay.
hopefully we'll get others to join us too. So I think I'll put in the next message that you don't have to have read the book yet if you haven't had a chance.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate so much. You get me thinking about different things every time. So thank you so much.
Oh, good.
So
Okay.
thank you, Dottie, and everybody, if you'll just fill out the form there to provide some feedback, that would be wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see you on the 7th and invite your friends and colleagues to join us as well, okay?
Thanks for help, Joanna.
Oh, sure.
See you again, Jared. Come back again, Gerald, even if you haven't read the book. And good luck on your grant application. That's a pain.
Yeah, it is. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, good. Okay.
All right.
All right.